Peter, wait.
Okay, now. Right. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Good afternoon, and welcome to the Hoon from the team at the Kaka with Bernard Hickey, the host, hostess with the mostest, and Peter Bale, his co-host. That's me, but I'm going to be leading it today because Bernard is at the Carbon Lounge at the airport, about to board a flight to go and talk to some hoteliers in Queenstown, who desperately need to hear his spiel on the politics. But the great thing is we're going to get the Bernard spiel first. We're then going to talk to Catherine Dyer, our climate expert from the Kaka, and then we're going to bring in Professor Robert Patman, our usual and wonderful guest from Otago University, and Josie Pagani, the Post columnist from Wellington. And we're going to really go through both international affairs and then come back into New Zealand politics towards the top of the hour, particularly given the shift that's happened today with the resolution of what the special votes have yielded, and what that might mean for the coalition negotiations and what kind of government we get. But welcome and thank you, everybody. Bernard, how are you over there?
Fantastic! It's great to see you in the big seat with the
The
fly-by
big chair,
wire,
I know.
with the fly-by-wire joystick. I'm here in
The less said about my joystick, the better, I think, today.
and
Thank you.
I'm here in the lounge, with the smell of carbon on my breath, about to fly to Queenstown, and that will be pretty much the last big trip I will do internally, and I will camp where we are and try and avoid burning more fossil fuels on flights. It's one of these hangovers from a while back, but it's great to be here and to say thank you for all of our loyal people for coming back after we were away last week. And
Yes, well, it was great. We got fabulous feedback, and I just want to give some feedback too. I mean, people really did miss it. I had set several people, and I'd also like to make a little call out to the very nice chap I sat next to at a Twitter journalism event this week, who said, I said, because I actually did recognise him from somewhere, and he said, "You don't know me, but I know you from the Hoon." And we got some great feedback, and I do appreciate it, because of course we do this for fun, pretty much. I mean, it's an adjunct to the Kaka, of course, but we are here for our own entertainment to some extent.
yes, with plenty of news this today, at least, with the election
Yeah.
results finalised at just after 2 o'clock.
And Bernard, what is your, I mean, not a hot take or a reckon, what's your considered view about what we saw today with National going down 2 seats? Presumably they'll get Waikato. What does it mean for Luxon, or for the shape of the government?
Well, it means that the very, very slim majority they had on election night is now gone. They only have 59 seats between them, National and ACT, in a 123-seat parliament. That means that they need Winston. So Winston is more in demand by National now than he was on election night. Now, he's not as in demand as he was in 2017, and that back then he was negotiating with both parties.
Yeah, he made that point I thought was quite interesting, really, that it would not only take less time, but presumably it also makes him less difficult, fractionally.
Yes, he isn't in a position to hold up two cards, one with yes and one with no, and have two different coloured mobile phones to brandish in everyone's faces. But he still has some power, because without those 8 seats that he has retained, National and ACT cannot go to the Governor-General and say we can exercise a majority in Parliament. So there will be a price for supplying confidence. You will talk later on with Josie and Robert, particularly around the foreign affairs issue. One of the interesting timing aspects to all of this is that the APEC meeting is in 9 or 10 days' time, and it seems that from the comments Christopher Luxon is making that he'd quite like to go as the Prime Minister, but if he
Well,
doesn't...
he certainly should, yeah.
And if he doesn't, then you'd expect someone like a new Foreign Minister to go as well. So,
But you might, I mean, presumably in the interim it would be Chris Hipkins who goes, yes, or Nanaia Mahuta, or both.
yeah, I mean, there have been a few stand-ins. Grant Robertson obviously went to the World Cup final as the Sports Minister, but I think that's about it. We're now well past the final results. It's very clear Luxon is going to be the PM. So they'll be pulling out the stops to get people sworn in, to get their ministerial warrants, and so he can go to APEC, because, it's been 2 or 3 weeks without a clear leader, and there will be quite a bit happening in APEC. No doubt you'll talk about
Yes,
that with
well,
Robert.
it's critical, yeah.
So, Christopher Luxon's champing at the bit to get in there and get cracking, as he said. There's things that they need and want to do. They've got a 100-day plan to enact, although it's not going to be as easy as they'd first hoped, in large part because they're going to have to rely on lots of other people to get things done. The best example of that is just this week, the Auckland Council has rejected plans for greenfields development around Auckland. So out in Henderson, up north past Albany, there was a whole bunch of developers ready to go with the greenfields. National has said they prefer greenfields to brownfields because then they don't have lots of NIMBYs screaming at them. And the Auckland Council said, nope, we're not going to do greenfields either because that means lots of infrastructure spending for us, and also a bunch of this greenfields is also in floodplains.
Yeah.
So we don't want to pay for the next flood disaster.
Especially not after this last couple of weeks where you've had these really very large responsibilities and settlements, which as I think Grant Robertson was talking about some weeks ago, is not going to be a sustainable way to do this ongoing climate problem.
$18.5 billion of losses from these two storms, and it was supposed to be a 1 in 200 year storm. Clearly they're going to have them more regularly than that, and we'll talk about that in a bit more depth with Catherine in a minute. But these climate events, they are massive. I attended a speech this morning from Adrian Orr about climate to a bunch of about 1,000.
Which apparently he got in a bit of trouble with David Seymour for even addressing the climate as a valid issue, which seems ridiculous given that the insurance and economic implications are gigantic.
Exactly, and Adrian Orr made good points in his speech to say that the climate is not only a financial stability issue for the long run, but also in the short run, and a macroeconomic issue, because as we've seen in the last couple of years, all these disasters is pushing up insurance costs at the very least, and that is part of the inflation story. All the supply shocks we've had, that's what causes inflation. So I think the word ridiculous is pretty accurate for the claim that climate change is not something that a Reserve Bank should think about. Also, he seems to forget that our Reserve Bank does prudential policy and manages financial stability for the economy as well, unlike central banks overseas who are mostly only about monetary policy.
It's actually got. I mean, funnily enough, we talked just ahead of the election, I think, about some of the news coverage of the central bank and of the whether we were having a soft landing from from high inflation and so on. And yet this week I finally heard somebody on the radio saying that in fact Adrian Orr did appear to have more or less delivered exactly that soft landing. I think we should be quite grateful in a way that the Reserve Bank Act allows that breadth of vision within setting monetary policy, including whether it's because I think National Act want to get rid of the employment aspect of the Reserve Bank's mandate.
The mandate, which is for the Reserve Bank to support the maximum sustainable employment, which actually is one of those weasel words to say we'll do what we think is necessary, but inflation is still number one for us. And I actually think removing that mandate won't change too much in the economy. However,
but it's important. It was particularly important under a Labor government, I think, to have it there, right?
And
symbol.
It's not radical. This is something the U.S. Federal Reserve, the Reserve Bank of Australia, have as well. And it does send a few bad signals, but I don't think it matters that much in the long run. What will matter, though, is that we've just had a housing boom. The day after the election, prices rose 20%, in my estimate. I see Tony Alexander has said this week that there'll be another 10% rise this year and 15% rise next year. The Reserve Bank will no doubt have to worry about whether a housing boom is going to start inflation again. And we could have the awkward prospect of Adrian Orr putting up interest rates at the end of February in one of his first acts under his new boss, Finance Minister Nicola Willis. And we learned this week from the Financial Stability Report that the Reserve Bank is looking to introduce debt-to-income multiple controls in the middle of next year.
Yeah, well, that'll be quite tricky. Or just for New Zealand buyers.
Everyone. And, of course, this is really in National's face. What the Reserve Bank would be doing would be limiting the ability of people to leverage up their equity, the untaxed and leveraged equity they have into more rental properties or owner-occupied properties.
Yeah.
And this will be a flashpoint between the new government and Adrian Orr. And there's a bunch of people behind the scenes who don't want to talk about it publicly, but are saying that there is a good chance that this clash between Willis, Christopher Bishop, and David Seymour, who've been remarkably public and aggressive in calling for his removal,
Yes, in the past, yes.
will cause an unprecedented split between our independent Reserve Bank and the government, something that we've managed to avoid for 30 years.
Yeah, no, I think they're very unwise. We've seen this with the Bank of England as well, with where the government will occasionally play politics there, but it's actually been this principle of an independent bank, independent central bank, very much reinforced, I think, by Gordon Brown when he came in under Blair as the Treasury Secretary, as the Chancellor of the Exchequer. But just going back 1 minute before we bring Catherine in, the Kaka environment correspondent, or climate correspondent, I guess it's everything correspondent, on the overhang, we've been partly because Te Pāti Māori has done so well. We now have a slightly expanded parliament. Is that right? Because of the way MMP works. Do you want to just see where that goes before we bring Catherine in?
So the normal state of affairs is we have 120 MPs in Parliament. But if you manage to win electorate seats on your own right more than your percentage share in Parliament, and in this case, Te Pāti Māori has won 6 electorate seats, but only has 3% of the vote. And in effect, they've got 2 more than they would have if it was only about their share of the vote. So that adds 2 to the number of seats in Parliament. And because of the weird accidental piece of constitutional history in which one of the candidates died during the election campaign, Port Waikato will be added on.
Yeah.
So we go from 120 to 123. And that makes it a little bit more difficult for a national act to govern and own. And it's one of the reasons that Winston Peters becomes more relevant again in our gerontocracy.
Yeah, it's so interesting, isn't it? And those Labour people, the Labour people who moved to Pāti Māori are now looking rather smart, it would seem.
Well, this is the interesting thing. The one electorate that Te Pāti Māori didn't win was the one where the incumbent Labour MP switched sides to Te Pāti Māori and was effectively kicked out by the electorate who were against her as a Labour MP. So even though Labour won that seat, you could argue that Te Pāti Māori won all of the seats in the Māori seats in Parliament, rejecting all of the Labour candidates. It happened that one of the Labour candidates was at this point a Te Pāti Māori candidate. So it really was a rejection by Tau Māori of Labour, complete rejection as electorate MPs, although no one was silly enough to not take advantage of the strategic ability to split their votes and to vote for Labour as their party vote and Te Pāti Māori as the electorate vote. Right. So that's going to put some interesting pressure on Parliament, and actually it means that you've got Labour with 34 seats, the Greens with 15, and Te Pāti Māori with 6. The opposition is going to be pretty heavy on Green and Te Pāti Māori, and Labour will have to fight to retain their relevance in
which is a kind of a good position to be in, given how exhausted they've been for the past 18 months or so.
Well, they're now going to have an ugly debate, just as they had an ugly debate after losing in 2008, which is what are they going to do about the capital gains tax and the wealth tax? Christopher Hipkins has nailed his feet to that mast, and either he has to go or he has to change his mind. And Labour,
very difficult to change his mind.
And Labour will have to make a call. Either they're going to stick with being the party of landlords along with National, just not quite as aggressive.
I think we talked about it that was actually a really dangerous reversal. Shall we bring Catherine in now, because you're going to drop out and get your plane at some point. And you've got some. Why don't you launch into the conversation with Catherine about these reports? So, Catherine, you're the Kaka climate guru.
Yes, thank you very much, Catherine, for jumping on. I have this housing theory of everything, which is very rapidly morphing into a housing and climate theory of everything. Catherine, could you give us We've got Catherine coming back there, I think. Just diving out and diving in. One of the key things I reported on this week was some advice from Treasury to the government, which essentially said that on our current trajectory, we're going to miss our Paris Agreement targets, and that means we're going to have to stump up with $26 billion, up to $26 billion to buy emissions credits overseas. And that is going to be a problem for whoever's in government at the time. Either they have to choose to renege on the Paris Climate Agreement, and I think quietly they may want to hope that everyone else fails as well.
That's right. No, I think that's happening in many democracies around the world. That people are wanting bigger places to admit that they failed, or everybody to admit the failure, which I guess is what we're going to see in Dubai at the COP in December.
Yeah, no, it's going to be a big moment. And also, people are looking to write the Paris agreements into the black letter law of their trade agreements. So we have this free trade agreement with Europe, which says if we breach the Paris Agreement rules, we will be turfed out of the agreement. Interestingly, just in the last week, we've seen from Australia. Australia decided to stop negotiating with Europe for a free trade agreement, in part because the Europeans wanted to write in a hard target for the Paris Agreement. So the Australians have managed to avoid getting snookered there. But it's going to be a problem for National. Remember, if National chooses to renege on the Paris Agreement, which, by the way, ACT says it should, although National have said they won't, if they renege on the Paris Agreement, that throws their own farmers under the bus.
Absolutely.
So that's going to be an issue there. And we'll find out how that goes. Great to see you again,
Catherine's
Catherine.
looking a little better there. Yep.
And I've gone through and sketched out the issue with the $26 billion worth of emissions credits and how it is eventually going to come down to a decision about reneging or not, and hoping at the last minute that everyone is in exactly the same position. I just wanted to ask you before I head off about a big paper that's come out this week from James Hansen, you could argue one of the most famous climate scientists in the world. Could you tell us, for the layman like me, what this means?
So he's come out. This paper has been floating around for the last year or so while it went through peer review before it actually got published. So it's just been published this week. And he's saying that climate sensitivity has been underestimated, that what the IPCC says is about 3 degrees climate sets for a doubling of CO2 in the atmosphere, you would get about 3 degrees of warming. He's saying that's more like 4.8% in the near term, and more like 10% when you go really far out for the current amount of greenhouse gas in the atmosphere. So there's that, and a lot of that is to do with the effect of aerosols, so pollutants in the atmosphere. He thinks that they're masking some of the actual heating that's already been happening. So he also thinks that the amount of heating we see each year is about to increase year on year. So yeah, there's quite a bit in his paper. It's 62 odd pages long. It goes back and looks at the paleo record. There's lots of technical data in it. But I think what's interesting is Michael Mann, who's the other towering figure in climate science, has come out saying, I completely disagree with James Hansen on this. So this is like, the Thriller in Manila or the Rumble in the Jungle kind of a thing. It's like the two biggest figures in climate science completely disagreeing with each other. And, who knows where that's going to come out. It's time to get out the popcorn and jousting sticks and see what happens.
Bernard, you're on mute.
I'd pay for a ticket to watch that. That would be fun. And but the headline of what Hansen is saying is that we're going to be at 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels by 2030. I mean, we're pretty much already.
The 20.
Yeah, this year it looks like it's going to exceed just this year alone 1.5 degrees. But he's also saying
these forecasts, like as Simon, our producer, was pointing out, 7 years. We're talking about 7 years rather than 47 years or 30.
No, there's no putting it off to the grandkids. Yeah. It's here right now, and
that's when he starts to say we should be A, building lots of nuclear, and B, looking at solar radiation management, which is some pretty big calls. And that's the stuff where it starts to get.
When you say solar
scary,
radiation
because,
management, Catherine, you're talking about geoengineering.
yes, geoengineering, spraying aerosols into the stratosphere to block sunlight from coming through to the Earth.
What could possibly go wrong? Yeah.
Exactly. You kind of, both of those things, you kind of look at them and go, those may potentially be plausible if you've got an entirely politically stable world for forever from now on to continue managing them. But if that's not going to be the case, then those things become little time bombs that can go off,
Yeah, and you've got some very interesting geopolitical, exactly that, but also you've got India, for example, doing very heavy investigations into cloud seeding and geo, they're very interested in the whole geoengineering aspect because they want, the next 30 years of development to be about India in the way that the last 30 years of development were about China.
And one of the things about geoengineering is that it essentially turns the problem-solving process into a unilateral one, whereas at the moment the problem-solving process is a combined thing. We all have to agree to do it to make it work, whereas with geoengineering, the Russians or the Chinese or the Indians who now can put things up there, and of course the Americans could decide, well, we're going to solve this problem by experimenting with the planet's atmosphere, which it's not great.
I think what I'm going to find really interesting is at this next global meeting of the UNFCCC, what kind of stories they come out with, or what kind of myth building they do to keep us all on board that things are still
Do you mean
control,
Dubai, or do you mean?
Yeah. Like if we're Dubai or the next one after that, but by 2030, if we've got a bunch of countries like New Zealand, Australia, UK who aren't going to meet their 2030 targets, and so start to renege on them, which is, I think, quite likely. What kind of story are you? And you've got these other things, other people saying, well, the climate sensitivity is much higher than we thought, and things are going to happen much more quickly. What stories do you start to pull together to convince people that actually we've got this? I think that's going to be fascinating.
I'm going to have to
certainly, Bernard. It's been lovely to have you at the Carbon Lounge, Catherine. Thank you so much for. And we've got the lovely Professor Robert Patman joining us from Otago University to discuss international affairs and what could be. We were just discussing climate, and of course the warnings yet again this week from some of the great climate scientists that we're nowhere near the 1.5 limit.
That's correct.
And of course, Bernard put that in a very good political context, which it means it makes much more likely that we may well renege on our own New Zealand commitments to 2030.
Yes, and of course makes the wider commitment to 2050 even more problematic.
Yeah. So how are you getting on, Robert? You've been writing like a mad thing publicly. I'm sure you've been working like a mad thing as well, particularly on...
Just juggling, actually, because there's a lot of public interest in what's going on, obviously, in the Middle East. But also, it's a very busy time of year, as you can appreciate, Peter. I'm swimming in exam scripts in the office at the moment.
But you're also working on my honorary doctorate, as we've discussed.
I nearly forgot. Yeah. As if I could forget.
Yeah, I just got my Coast Guard day skipper certificate yesterday, so I'm very much hoping it's going to be something quite similar. That you'll just post it to me and say, having done all these podcasts with you and read your thing on Spinoff, here's your doctorate. Now, you've been writing a couple of quite interesting pieces, I think, Robert. One today for the ODT, the Otago Daily Times, and another, I think, double byline earlier in the week with the Conversation.
Professor Al Gillespie, yeah.
Yeah, about the New Zealand diplomatic aspect and potential influence for New Zealand on the Israel-Hamas thing. Do you want to talk about that a little bit? Because I think that's a really super relevant one to what you do, and then we can talk about what's actually going on this week.
Yes, sure. There was concern, I think, there was a bit of a disconnect going on between many people in this country being deeply concerned about the situation in the Middle East and the fact the relative silence that was coming from our politicians. And of course, we've been in this political interregnum. And it is a pity that we have not made our voice clearer, but we have a new government in sight, I suppose, now with the special vote in. And so we may get greater clarity. But I think both Al and myself feel that New Zealand does can present itself as the voice of reason to some degree, and this is a very dangerous situation that we are seeing unfold. It's a catastrophic situation, actually, and it's important that smaller countries do not sit on the sidelines. And I was pleased to see that New Zealand, actually, although it was the only member of the Five Eyes to do so, voted for the Jordanian-sponsored resolution, which was calling for an immediate humanitarian truce, leading to a permanent cessation of hostilities. And Chris Luxon confirmed in the last 24 hours that he stands by that vote, and he was consulted about it and feels it's the right thing to do. We joined company with likes of Ireland, but many countries either abstained. When I say many countries that we consider our traditional allies either abstained or opposed it. And when you see the scenes unfolding,
let's just explain why they opposed it or abstained. Partly because it didn't explicitly talk about the October 7 trigger of the conflict, right?
Yes, and it didn't also pay enough attention to Israel's right of self-defense, and also didn't say enough about what triggered. But you see, there is some contestation around what triggered it, because clearly, while in no way condoning the appalling violence by Hamas, which actually has been terrible news for most ordinary Palestinians, has made their lives hell, basically. And it must be very galling for many Palestinians to know that much of the leadership, or at least some of the prominent leaders of the Hamas leadership, are in the Gulf states.
Being quite happily watching it from Qatar,
But yeah, I mean, I think that I think it's important that New Zealand it's traditionally had good relations with the Palestinians and the Israelis, has no axe to grind. And I think it's important that New Zealand's role, I think, not necessarily on its own, but with countries like Ireland and other countries in Scandinavia, keep the discussion going that military force will not solve a political problem which has been going on for 7 decades. Draw attention to the terrible human costs of this bombardment that's going on in the Gaza Strip. And thirdly, and perhaps most importantly, remind the actors that they must consider what comes next. Even if Israel succeeds in eliminate or eradicating Hamas, that's not going to solve the problem.
No.
And so it's important that we do have small and middle powers saying, actually, guys, we do need to not just address the symptoms of this 7-decade conflict, but we need to address its deep-seated.
Absolutely. And this is I'll come back to that in a minute. But I just want to ask you, when you have this kind of interregnum between governments, what do you understand was the process of the New Zealand permanent representative to the UN deciding that? I mean, interesting that you said that Luxon was consulted. Would that still go through Nanaia Mahuta as
I would assume
provisional?
So. Let's be quite clear. The diplomats at the UN will be taking political instructions. Sometimes there's a bit of confusion, and actually politicians inadvertently fuel this confusion. They say, oh, I can't comment on that because I haven't been briefed by my officials, which almost suggests the officials make policy. They don't.
Well, that's what I was wondering on this case.
It's the politicians that formulate it. So we must infer, I think, Peter, that Chris Hipkins and Luxon's, that these two leaders were in touch and their respective advisors and formulated a common position, which in time for the vote last Friday on the 27th of October. And New Zealand made it quite clear, its deputy permanent representative made it quite clear, New Zealand wasn't happy with we didn't necessarily think the resolution was perfect. It's just we felt the alternative of abstaining or opposing it was even less value. So given the desperate situation at the moment.
Yeah.
So
just going for a minute then, Robert, to the question of not resolving some of the longer term situations behind here. I was really struck reading a remarkable piece by Simon Sebag Montefiore, who, while very strongly, supporting Israel's right to exist and so on, and having his own huge personal historic family history to the Zionist movement and to Israel, was very much of the view, or expressed the very strong view, that there has to be, out of this, going back to another two-state conversation or two-state type solution. And then you've got Anthony Blinken, the Secretary of State, going to Israel again today. Clearly, it would seem that the Americans are starting to get more nervous even than they perhaps were, that Netanyahu's got no interest in that, and it's all for him about a zero-sum game of destroying Hamas.
Yeah, but you see the big problem, and it's incumbent on the United States to raise this issue. And I hope Mr. Blinken does, because I think America misjudged the situation initially, because they gave unqualified support to Israel's right to defend itself. But as international lawyers point out, the right to self-defense is not unlimited. And it's got to be conducted in humanitarian laws, which means that civilians that were not involved in the Hamas attack on Israel should be protected. And any targeting of those responsible, I think few people would quibble with the idea that those responsible for that appalling attack on Israel should be targeted. But it's quite clear that a lot of people are dying that had nothing to do with the attack.
Absolutely.
And that's what makes many of us very uncomfortable. And it's important for Mr. Blinken. I think America perhaps underestimated the scope of the Israeli operation when they supported it initially. I don't know. I'm surprised when I say that myself. I'm surprised at myself saying that, because the Americans have dealt with Mr. Netanyahu for many years, and they may have felt that by giving him a relatively blank check at the beginning, they may have some leverage over him subsequently.
Well, certainly by going to see, Biden taking that. I mean, I wrote about this, and I think you thought I was being a bit Pollyannish about this. And it was described by Franklin Foer in the Atlantic as being the hug Bibi strategy, and of course, Bibi is himself a bit of a porcupine, and you can get a bit hurt cuddling porcupines, let alone making love with them, which apparently is was going to be a dad joke, but I'm not doing any dad jokes. Josie, it's so good to see you. Josie is the columnist from The Post and an international aid expert. We were just talking with Prof. Robert about Gaza and New Zealand's role in this. Robert wrote that piece that I think you've seen Brilliant, in the ODT. It's interesting, and you know the Labour Party very well, and you probably also know these interregnum time periods. Very interesting that the New Zealand permanent representative voted the way she did in New Zealand with the Jordanian vote that was ultimately struck down. What do you think goes on in that sort of situation?
Yeah, and I was just listening to your conversation, and it's so interesting, because I think as you said, Peter, the problem is that when you call for a ceasefire, unless, and Jewish people across the world are feeling this, I think, but unless you're also being clear that the ceasefire has to be Hamas too,
yes,
and it has to involve Egypt, Jordan, the countries surrounding Palestine and Israel need to get involved in this too, and be part of a deal that is guaranteeing a ceasefire for Israel as well, because it's not just, it's not just, and you're absolutely right, Robert. I mean, we have to keep our eye on what's the long game here. And both Hamas and Netanyahu's government do not want a two-state solution. So,
well, they've certainly. He's staked the last 20 years of his political career.
But I think
on
Hamas.
Containment,
I think you're absolutely right, Josie. But I think Hamas have technically changed their position. Whether it's a substantive change, I don't know. Yeah. But in 2017, they said they now accept it as two-state solution based on the 1967 boundaries at the end of the Six-Day War, which Israel, of course, won quite handsomely. So they do say they now have changed their position. So that's interesting. It's only something I learned in the last few days, because I was under the impression, like many people, that going by their commentary and their general stance, that they just oppose the very existence of Israel, but they insist their political arm says they don't.
So, Robert, their constitution, though, such as it is, I mean, their manifesto is very clear that it's from the river to the sea. They do not support the state of Israel. So even if they are now saying, oh, yes, we do, it's still I mean, I think that I keep thinking about, I grew up in the 80s in England, born in New Zealand, grew up over there. And I think of the IRA and Sinn Féin. And I remember, as a student hosting a debate with Sinn Féin and the Unionists because it was banned at the time.
Yes.
The difference there is that, the IRA were a terrorist organisation trying to get Britain out of Ireland, and out of Northern Ireland. Hamas has never believed that the state of Israel
is legitimate,
should exist and legitimate. So I think that's the problem with the ceasefire call rather than the humanitarian pause call, is that what people hear is that we're going to somehow co-opt Hamas and pretend that you can negotiate with them.
I agree, but I think one of the things that boosts Hamas, ironically, is intense military pressure.
Yes.
I think the reason I think it's so important that New Zealand makes its voice heard about the way ahead is because if most Palestinians had a pathway to a clear, viable state, I think that would reduce Hamas's leverage amongst the Palestinians. And so,
absolutely.
Many Israelis are saying this. There's a lot of criticism of Netanyahu at the moment.
Yeah.
I was listening to Gideon Levy, who writes for Haaretz, and he was saying that, in a sense, you shouldn't underestimate Mr. Netanyahu's self-interest in prolonging this conflict.
Absolutely, that's exactly the point I was trying to make in my spin-off thing this week. That he is the classic survivor. You really have to get a stake and quite a lot of garlic to deal with them, and no one's managed to do with that politically. And I'm not suggesting the assassination of the Israeli Prime Minister,
which is. There's no silver lining in this situation. It is all just hideously awful. But I think Netanyahu, I think he's politically, I think he's done.
Absolutely.
I mean, you think,
but he won't be done necessarily while he's still the Prime Minister.
But a lot of people are being killed in the meantime.
That's right.
And a lot of innocent people and children. And this tragedy, and it is utter tragedy, and it's a terrible indictment of where we are in the 21st century. Because once again, the UN Security Council has been shown to be totally dysfunctional and not fit for purpose. And, it's just the veto has become an agent of international destabilization, not the hope.
Gosh, that's a very good line, Robert. Just to say that again, an agent of international destabilization.
Yeah,
I like that.
In a sense, veto, many countries like New Zealand under Peter Fraser reluctantly accepted the veto in the post-45 period because they believed, although they didn't approve of it, that it was good to have the great powers inside the UN so that they could help bring about solutions to security problems.
Yeah.
And that was quite reasonable at the time, but it was based on the assumption that the UN, the Security Council, was capable of self-interested international cooperation. The problem is that's unraveled in the 21st century, where we have, countries like Russia, the United States, China, quite happy to cast the veto for very partisan, self-interested reasons and frustrating international solutions. And the rest of the trouble is the rest of the world is paying the price for 5 countries having this privilege, and it's very frustrating.
There is, because I think you're absolutely right. And I think one of the things post-Ukraine and now with this tragedy unfolding in the Middle East, I think there'll be a mandate, surely, for revisiting the veto again. And it can be done, can it not, through the General Assembly. So I know we can't do it through Security Council because the veto will veto the veto. But through the General Assembly, there is a mechanism, if there was a majority of the General Assembly, to revisit that veto and either create more permanent members so that you don't have a couple of members able to veto, or there are many ways in which the veto could be reformed if you can get that majority at the General Assembly. Isn't that right, Robert? I think.
Yes, I think that is right, Josie. But although I fear that adding to more permanent members with the veto may actually increase the deadlock.
Yes.
But I take your point. Actually, it may be a silver cloud. There may be some silver lining to this situation, and that is if the General Assembly actually says what it believes, that the 5 permanent members should not have the veto and frustrate things. And I've always been struck by the fact that there's tremendous support for abolishing the veto, but also because the 3 permanent members, China, the US and Russia, are so powerful, many of them are very reluctant to say that publicly.
That's right. But can we just move from one 75-year-old intractable problem with a dreamy attitude to changing the Security Council to, in fact, changing the balance towards using this crisis, using this tragedy, as you put it, Josie, in Gaza, towards generating a positive outcome of a renewed Palestinian organization that can actually represent Palestinians well. I was really struck today, and it, you know, in a sense, I could have written it myself based on the Pollyanna stuff I've written the last couple of weeks that Robert's taken me to task for. But The Economist this week in its editorial,
so sensitive.
yeah, no, I'm extremely sensitive. It's I know it's been it points off my doctorate. But did I mention my doctorate again, Robert? But
You did.
It's all in hand, Peter.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
The Economist
passed
is
it already.
arguing that Netanyahu must have a free hand right now to destroy and decapitate Hamas, but that it must immediately then stop and he step down and there be rapid talks on establishing an alternative Palestinian Authority and starting meaningful talks towards a two-party solution.
Before Robert shuts that down, because I can see,
Yeah.
I know what you're going to say, Robert, and you'll be far more informed than I. But I think one of the things that's led to this situation is of course that Netanyahu has supported, and quite happily, in many ways, which is so cynical, Hamas as against the PLO or PA,
Yes.
because both Hamas and Netanyahu don't want or certainly to date haven't wanted a two-state solution. So one of the ways in which Israel has fallen down is not to support, a Palestinian Authority that can at
Absolutely.
least deliver for its people. And now they have to do that, and it has the pressure. That's what I mean about if you're going to do if we're going to call for a ceasefire, the part of it has to be more resourcing and support for the PA, for the PLO, and support from Arab partner countries around Palestine and Israel to decapitate Hamas.
Which there was some possibility of in that idea of Saudi normalization, because although historically Riyadh doesn't really care about the Palestinians, they did appoint an ambassador to open an embassy and appoint an ambassador to the Palestinian Authority. And it was clear that they were not going to accept the terms of normalization without a clear pathway to a destination for the Palestinian people. I think also sorry, Robert, you wanted to.
No, I just wanted to say I actually agree with the need to keep the two-state solution on the political agenda. I think it's critical. And Josie's absolutely right to say Mr. Netanyahu and Hamas have not been particularly thrilled with that prospect. But there is some real practical problems. And the practical problems is that the pace of settlements. Successive US administrations, apart from the Trump administration, but if you look at every other administration going back to Clinton, have constantly publicly rebuked Israel for illegal settlements, which they say is illegal under international law, which it almost certainly is according to most international lawyers.
Yes.
And yet Israel, and you mentioned this point earlier, Peter, Netanyahu and other Israeli leaders have been quite happy to take American support, but actually not always take their advice or even listen to them. And they've gone ahead with settlement. Now there's close to 600,000 Israeli settlers in the West Bank. And where's the viable state going to be?
That's right. That's right.
How,
well, if you look at it, yeah, I mean,
how
I
is
was
that going to
thinking,
be created?
if you remember, after Oslo, there was talk about a kind of motorway network between the West Bank and Gaza, with flyovers and Christ knows what. But there's, you couldn't even do that now because it's such a checkerboard.
The Greens would campaign against that.
Yeah, but let's go back for one, because I think also there's an aspect, and I don't want to make this into a media story, but and I also do not. Well, I seldom believe those stories when people say why isn't the mainstream media reporting it, because they almost always are. But the expulsions of Palestinians and Bedouin from territory in the occupied territories in the West Bank has gone on quite dramatically this week, along with some very nasty sectarian attacks against Palestinians by extreme settlers, which of course, just to be fair, does not condone any of the other things that have been going on with anti-Semitic attacks on Jews around the world. But the possibilities of the West Bank catching fire, it's amazing really that it hasn't much more so far.
No, but you're quite right. I think it's interesting that President Macron this week protested to Netanyahu about the treatment of Palestinian farmers. I mean, we're talking at
Yeah.
a time when more than 100 Palestinians have been killed. Some have been killed in peaceful protests.
Yes.
They haven't got arms,
Yeah.
but they protested about being evicted from their houses by armed settlers who are accompanied by the Israeli army. And viewed from Palestinian eyes, the Israelis, particularly under Mr. Netanyahu, seem to be trying to close off the option of any
Yes.
Palestinian state
Exactly.
in the future. That's the way
Exactly.
they're reading it.
And yeah.
I remember when the Gaza Strip was relinquished by Israel in 2005. There was a big storm in Israeli politics at the time because something like 8,000 Israeli settlers had to return
Yes.
to Israel, which caused a bit of a storm. Just imagine
think-
if you've got
600,000. Yeah.
600,000, you know,
And of course, remember, it was Ariel Sharon who managed to do that.
yeah, who was pretty brutal.
Sorry,
part
Josie.
of any, I was just, well, I mean, this is one of the big barriers to getting to some future solution, isn't it? What do you do about the settlers? And of course it's illegal. International law lawyers have, you know, overwhelmingly agreed that it's illegal, as is the wall. But then what is it that you do about the people who've settled there and built houses? And so part of a deal surely has to be the cost of relocating.
Absolutely. And they also believe they have a
the
God-given right to
settlers.
be there.
Yeah.
You know,
Yes,
that God has
and
said that that's where
so
they need to be.
there's a wonderful, it's the Israeli writer, I've forgotten his, Amos Oz,
Yeah.
a novelist. He's passed away now. He was a peace activist and a lefty, and he you know, it's this idea that we're trying to see this as a football match of good guys, bad guys, right, wrong, my team, your team, and he came up with this lovely quote, which is just, you know, so pertinent now. Yeah, it's infinitely more tragic than right versus wrong. It's a clash of right versus right.
Yeah.
Two peoples with deep wounds, howling with grief, fated to share the same small piece of land. And,
Yeah, well,
and so that
if
has
we're
to be
talking
where
about
you start
authors
from.
to recommend, apart from Amos Oz, Josie, I recommend to people Raja Shahadi, who wrote the wonderful book Palestinian Walks, which is he's a Palestinian doctor and peace activist who has written the two wonderful books about what it means to walk as he did as a child from his and through his ancient territories and farms, and how it's all just been divided up and sliced up. It's a very moving piece. What about the question of the contract that is? I interviewed Anthony Lowenstein, who's a very interesting Australian journalist, Jewish author, who gets into a lot of stick with other Jews about his concern about the Israeli treatment of the Palestinians. I mean, his thesis is that Israel has built that extraordinary defensive state, containment state, that has been broken, shown to be a sham, but in doing so, it's also broken the Israeli government's contract with its own people, which is to protect them.
Totally.
Where does this all leave them?
Surely it means the end of Netanyahu, and you just look at the numbers of people, the pictures of, you know, reservists, soldiers, Israeli Defense Force, you know, citizens protesting on the streets of Israel before this happened, before October the 7th, and that hasn't gone away. In fact, that's now, you know, that feeling of being led down this bloody, insecure,
yes, believing that believing that the walls are
path.
impregnable and that you had the problem contained and it could be contained, when, as you
yes,
say, it's two rights facing each other. But
So
may
I think
ask,
that's where it leaves us. doesn't it?
Josie, I want you to stay on, and Robert, please to stay on. We'll flip to some New Zealand
Yes,
questions
please.
in a minute. But Robert, it was very interesting today. The head of the Ukrainian army says we're at a stalemate. Putin is obviously, in a sense, enjoying what's going on here as a distraction from Ukraine. Netanyahu declined the offer of the visit from Zelensky. Where does our frequent focus on Ukraine sit with all of this?
Well, I think there's some worrying developments because we've got a new Republican speaker in the United States in the Congress, Michael Johnson, and he's indicated in the past that he was unsympathetic to funding and supporting Ukrainian resistance to Putin's invasion, and he's slightly backpedaled on that. Now he's got the job. And I noticed that Mr. Biden in the last 24 hours is going ahead with a $425 million package for the Ukrainians. But I think there's a big question mark now. And this question mark will probably become even more pronounced as we move into 2024 with the US election looming, particularly if the Republicans win, about America's staying power in supporting Ukraine. And the question is, will the Europeans and others step up? And General Solution's article, which was reproduced in The Economist, very interesting. And he admitted that the counteroffensive, after 5 months, had not made the progress they hoped, although he did indicate they had made quite significant progress in the Crimea and the Black Sea. He said they have, amongst other things, they haven't got a navy, and they've basically done quite a lot of damage to the Russian position there in the Black Sea. But he was quite candid and said that a battle of attrition, where they're making only, they've only advanced about 17 kilometers on in many parts of the front, is playing into Russia's hands.
Yes, very
and
much so.
he made it interesting. He called for several things. He said, first of all, we've got to turn this round, we've got to have air control of the skies. That comes in two ways. The F-16s are clearly being flagged. They're on their way, but again, it's been quite slow.
I think training started this week in Romania, and
So that's one thing. But the second thing, which was interesting, was he also hinted that they need much more. He didn't name the systems, but he said they need much more effective defense anti-missile systems, which are Patriot batteries, I think he's referring to. And he also called, and this was probably the major point he was making, for greater innovation, which again I think is decoded means more drones.
Yeah.
The Russians, the Ukrainians have had spectacular success with $600 drones. They've been knocking out, amongst other things, $4 million T-90 tanks.
Yes.
Which must be very galling for the Kremlin to see the state-of-the-art tank knocked out by a $600 drone.
I imagine it was certainly galling for the Israelis to see one of their tanks taken out by a Hamas drone. Could we move just back, because we're coming close to the top of the hour, as we say, on this in us professional broadcasters.
You're the most professional one amongst us, Peter.
Back to the. I don't think so. Yeah, we created Robert out of a piece of plasticine, and he's become a major media lovey now. But
really,
Josie, we went before you came in, Robert. When Bernard was on at the top of the other hour, we were talking about the New Zealand elections, the information today about where the special votes has gone. National will probably get Waikato, but it looks as though Mr. Kingi is in fact going to be the kingmaker again. How are you seeing this play out there, and particularly as Foreign Affairs would seem to be one of the places where he may get deposited?
Well, before I get to Foreign Affairs, I think the biggest takeout from this, from the specials, I think, is that all the small parties have something huge to celebrate.
Thank you. Somebody asked that question. Asked us to ask you that question, so please address that. Yeah.
Because someone said to me, actually, it was on election night. They said everybody won but Labor on election night. And I think that's true. And now these small parties. So you've got the Greens have got the biggest result ever with the most MPs ever in Parliament. ACT have won 2 electorates rather than just one. Te Pāti Māori Extraordinary have 6 out of 7 of the Māori
and changes the balance of a whole of Parliament as a result.
Yes, so each of the small parties has something big to celebrate, and I think Nationals in government, and they're going to have to work with New Zealand First and Winston Peters, but they're still in government, and so you look at it and you go, well, the one loser here is Labor yet again, and just. There's no good news.
No, it's another rebuilding phase, isn't it?
It's another rebuilding phase, but also they would have probably liked to lose a few of those electorates so that they could, keep more
bulk
people
up
on the list. Yes. Oh, sorry. No, National would have rather lost some seats.
I see,
Sorry,
yeah.
National would have rather lost some seats because they've only got a few people on the list, and they were looking to get James Christmas in because they wanted him to be Attorney General and do treaty stuff. Whereas Labor, it's the other way around, that they've lost so many electorates that they've got a whole bunch of people on the list that they might not wanted to have protected, actually. So what they've got is everybody on the list down to, your mother and your uncle is now in that Labor caucus. In other words, everybody who just lost them the election is still there.
Interesting.
So it's hard to see where that renewal comes from. If it was the All Blacks team, the All Blacks that are going to lose.
Oh, God, can we not mention the... I mean, I can't get away from the buggers.
One sporting analogy. And I'm doing so well on my sporting analogies because I got into this World Cup, so I feel like I've got to make the most of it while I've got it. But it's like, the All Blacks are going to lose nine All Blacks after this World Cup, but they're still probably going to win every game next year because they've got so many good players. Not the case with Labour.
Bench. Yeah. But and what about this question of foreign affairs? I mean, we've discussed before. I mean, we know Winston loved that job. Like I think I've said before, the history of the foreign service suggests that the people there respect him. Is that the place to park him?
I think so, and I think we maybe even might have talked about this, but this week he came out and said it's really important that New Zealand's at the Pacific Island Forum. We need to be seen there. This is our most important near relationship. This in Australia, and he's right. As well as APEC. And so you go, right, there's the next foreign affairs minister in waiting. So I think he doesn't want speaker. Of course he doesn't. I mean, there's only 2 New Zealand First MPs, him and Shane Jones.
He'd also be a shocking speaker.
They need to do stuff.
Yeah.
He'd be entertaining. But he doesn't want that because how can you possibly build a political party?
And Robert, what are you thinking MPs? about foreign Minister of Foreign Affairs?
Jerry Brownlee's going to PIF, by the way.
To what?
Which is interesting.
What's PIF?
To the Pacific Island Forum.
Oh, is he?
Yeah. So
they'll have to get a very large lava for him. Yeah. What? Go on, Robert.
I agree with what Josie says. I mean, we could obviously see a situation where Mr. Peters reclaims his foreign minister position, I should say. But I'm wondering whether Chris Luxon actually, reading between the lines, I mean, Mr. Luxon's very careful in his public pronouncements. And he's been very careful, I think, to, how should I put it, indulge Winston quite a bit. But I'm wondering whether he actually believes, given the current situation, he wants someone closer to National's view on international affairs. Because it struck me that there's not too much difference between Labour and National and foreign policy. I'm not sure if
including
that's the
on the
case
climate.
Between New
That's
Zealand
right.
first.
Including on the climate, yeah.
And I
That's
think
interesting, Robert. Yeah.
And I'm just wondering whether Luxon wouldn't want to be embarrassed. I'm not saying he would embarrass the country. I'm just saying from Luxon's point of view, he may feel that he did say he wanted to see New Zealand much more active on the global stage, both commercially and diplomatically. And I'm not sure Mr. Luxon sees Mr. Peters in that role. He doesn't want to see a sort of chair of the board foreign minister.
No, and Jerry Brownlee's been saying some really measured and interesting things through the campaign. I mean, I did a debate with him, a panel thing where he was his position on AUKUS was very measured. It's like, no, we're not going to step into Pillar 2 and we want to know what it is. We're not just going to automatically side with the Americans. A little bit more nuanced on China, whereas. Yeah, you're right. I think there is a bit of difference there from a New Zealand First perspective of being perhaps a little more accommodating, certainly in the past, of Russia, maybe.
That's what if I was Mr. Luxon, I might worry that he may find himself at loggerheads with his own foreign minister. And you see, that's a big challenge for Mr. Luxon because, everybody's taught, you'll know this much better than I do, Josie, the whole question of managing this coalition. And I think he'll pick a foreign minister hopefully that is not just good at the job, but also doesn't disrupt, from Mr. Luxon's point of view, keeping this coalition together.
But the thing is, I've been with Winston Peters overseas, and you guys have seen this too. He's very professional. He reads a room. He respects everyone from the smallest country in the Pacific to the biggest country, he navigates his way through that stuff quite well. And he's on perhaps his last 3 years. Who knows?
Yeah.
He's going to be focused
No, I think
on
that would be a good way to go out.
of statesmanship and so on. I think Luxon's got two good choices there: Jerry Brownlee or Winston Peters.
Yeah. So Josie, what else? Are you picking this guy James Christmas as the next Attorney General?
Well, no, because I think he's. That's
You
what
think
I mean.
he's stuffed?
He's not in,
Uh-huh.
because they've done too well.
So he'll be the head of the Royal Commission into treaty which they'll get from.
That's right. Maybe what will happen with Labor, because they've got too many people on the list now. There'll be some resignation.
Yeah.
I suspect. I think Grant Robertson will go. Depending on whether there's a leadership stoush, maybe David Parker will decide he's done his dash, and people who can't win their seats, who are on the list, are probably going to have to count their days, and the pressure will come on them to resign.
Are there any quirky ones that you I mean, what might David? I mean, again, Bert and I discussed this today, and we said we're still going to do it from a sort of solutions journalism point of view, not a racehorse point of view. But where might David Seymour end up? Do you think?
So he'll want something around regulation, planning, finance, so he's not going to get finance, obviously, because that's Nicola Willis, but he'll want something. He'll want an associate portfolio there, I think, and maybe something around economic development.
I was wondering about that sort of industry, some sort of industry
Yeah,
aspect. Yeah,
and something around planning and regulation and blowing up the public sector. So if there's a minister of blowing up the public sector, that'll be
excellent, good. So look, thank you so much, both of you, Robert Patman and Josie Pagani, for being on.
At the top of the hour.
I'm at the top of the hour. I'm just going to quickly do a tiny skateboarding dog, knowing that our publisher Simon, or our producer Simon, will trim this for the one that goes out tomorrow. And I'd like to use some incredibly rude swear words, which were used this week by Dominic Cummings, mostly in his evidence to the British COVID inquiry. And Dominic was the supposed Svengali, described by David Cameron as a psychopath, probably quite rightly. And I'm not actually. Bernard asked me not to use the word beginning with C and ending in T that he used quite regularly. And then Cummings was asked whether he was being misogynistic by having talked about a woman using those terms, and he said, No. I was far worse to men than I was to women, which is an excellent way of getting out of the misogynistic realm. But I loved the way the Guardian correspondent or commentator Marina Hyde described the cabinet handling of COVID as being like putting Real Housewives in charge of the Manhattan Project.
Yeah,
and so I think whatever we think of the way New Zealand handled it, at least it wasn't Boris. And I felt we could see all this at the time, and I thoroughly encourage everybody to watch Kenneth Branagh's portrayal of Boris in a thing called This England, which is harrowing because it's a little too close to the bone, as it were.
Yeah.
Can I just add that one thing to that
Justice.
Marina Hyde's great line of where she described Liz Truss's very brief premiership as a drive-by premiership.
No, she's fabulous, and she also described Dominic Cummings as in terms of the Manhattan Project as Robert Stroppenheimer.
That's right.
All right. Well, we've all been very stroppy today, and thank you so much, everybody. I know you'll all miss Bernard, but hopefully he'll be back and Perky. And to David Morrig's question, I think Bernard has brought climate change to Waiheke.
You're in the hot seat now, Peter,
and it's not looking good. Bernard, I know that Mrs. Bernard had to swim to the New World the other day, so it's not easy. See you, and thank you so much for everybody for following.
Thank you, guys.
And to Simon,
have a nice weekend.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody.